During the pandemic, as we more heavily rely on protective gear like masks and gloves, those items have been seen carelessly tossed into city streets and parks. We're also relying on takeout food orders, which comes with single-use plastic. So to talk about added pollution concerns, we're talking with Executive Director of the Ecology Center in Berkeley. That's Martin BOURQUE. Thanks for joining us, Martin.
My pleasure.
So there's already a challenge with many items that aren't being able to be recycled. Would you tell us about the personal protective equipment specifically known as PPE and how that plays a factor here too?
Yeah, well, none of the PPE is recyclable. So that's the first thing people should know. It shouldn't end up in a recycling bin. It is disposable and should go in the garbage can. And we are seeing obviously a lot more of it out on the streets being littered, um, and obviously there's way more being used than in normal times. So it's very unfortunate that at a time when we really need to be reducing our dependence on plastic and fossil fuels, we're in this sort of unprecedented uh, need or dependence on it.
So when using these gloves and these masks, it's in order to protect us from a virus. So are they then considered toxic items, and how do we properly throw them away?
Yeah, I'm not a medical doctor. I can't really speak to the hazards that might be involved, but I can say that what we're hearing from health officials is that for household use of PPE, they should be bagged and put in the garbage. Obviously, at hospitals, that's probably making it into their infectious waste, but under no circumstances should it end up in the recycling bin. It's
Is
just
there
not recyclable.
Right. So is there some sort of a push to have people rely instead on some reusable items, or to possibly you resort to like fabric masks that have been sewn that you can then wash instead?
Sure, fabric masks are great and provide some level of protection. They can be handled safely and washed and reused many times. For most, people, that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do. And so, that's what we would recommend over disposable, say, surgical masks are not really that much different than a fabric covering. It's quite different than what they might use in intensive care or in a hospital, but for most purposes, for the average person, that's fine.
And so my understanding is that small businesses are now relying on takeout and delivery orders because that's their only way of delivering food to people. And Berkeley has banned single-use plastic, but there are many cities across the Bay Area that haven't done that. And since this has been the only method for restaurants to operate, is there concern of more plastic pollution as a result?
Yeah, again, at a time when we really need to be reducing our reliance on disposable plastic, we're seeing a huge surge in it. Just in our recycling program alone, we're seeing about a 30% increase in residential recycling. That is probably a combination of glass and cardboard and plastic. So, a lot more online purchasing, a lot more takeout food, and people are eating at home, obviously, a lot more, so they're creating more recyclables at home. At the same time, we're seeing a dramatic reduction in the volume of recyclables and waste coming out of businesses. So the two are sort of offsetting each other. But here in Berkeley, the ordinance that was passed was designed to reduce overall the use of disposable foodware and rely more on reusable foodware, both for in-house eating and then also explore reusables for takeout. And so we hope to see more of that as we go forward and businesses start opening again.
So should people be encouraged to ditch the plastic utensils, for example, that are being offered by these restaurants for takeout and delivery and say, you know what, I got my own at home?
Yeah, that was one of the first things that the ordinance addressed is what we call accessory foodware. This would be utensils, straws, lids, those kinds of things. Those really should be on a on a by request only basis. So, when somebody's making an order, there should be an ask on the app or by the restaurant if it's over the phone. Do you need additional accessory foodware? And or when you make the order, just saying, please don't send any. Most of that stuff, obviously, if you're eating at home, is totally unnecessary and ends up just getting tossed anyways.
And I feel like people are under this misconception that just because something is plastic that it can be recycled. What are some of those items that maybe cannot be because of their form?
Yeah, so for about 30 years now, the plastics industry has been working very hard to convince us all that everything plastic is recyclable and that plastic is actually an environmentally friendly packaging. That couldn't be farther from the truth. The only two things that are really recyclable in the current marketplace are number one and number two bottles. That would be beverage bottles, like water bottles and soda bottles, and jugs for like shampoo or detergent. So anything with a narrow neck is likely going to get recycled, whereas virtually everything else is not going to get recycled.
And why is that?
Well, there just are too many different kinds of things, and most of this stuff doesn't have any reliable markets. For many years, exporting it to China was an option. That is no longer an option. And in China, they just picked out the best stuff and dumped the rest or burned it. And so it was pretty awful environmental impacts to that, collect all plastics. And, what the industry told us was throw it all in the bin, let the magic fairies sort it out in the land of unicorns and rainbows. And that's really so far from what was actually happening with those materials in China. And so no longer can we ship that stuff to China. And most of it's probably going to landfill in the US now.
And you're basically mentioning what is now also in the news in light of this pandemic is a global supply chain. What is happening now with our trash in that sense?
Well, with regards to like exports of recyclables,
Yes.
yeah, we're still seeing, recycling markets recovering or trying to recover from China's ban. About 2 years ago, China said they were no longer going to take America's scraps. And so those are struggling to find marketplaces both in the US and internationally. So some of the impacts of that are, the paper, which is sort of the financial backbone and the largest tonnage in recycling programs. The prices on that have gotten very low, and that's challenging a lot of municipalities and recycling programs financially. Those materials, the markets for them are growing in other places. So we're seeing investment in the US in new mills and retooling mills. We're seeing new mills pop up in other countries in Asia and Canada and Mexico. But that's a long-term process. Those mills are going to take several years to come online. And once they do, they'll be quite hungry for materials, and that demand will hopefully drive up the price of those recyclables.
What is it about this industry that has it so that we have to outsource to get our trash put into a particular place or get recycled? Is it not financially rewarding enough to have an incentive to have plants like that here in the US and even in California?
Well, when we started recycling, the Ecology Center started curbside recycling in 1973. It was the first program in the nation, and we had local infrastructure in places to sell this stuff locally. Over the years, China, put out very aggressive program to buy up as much of that material as they could, and U.S. Buyers really couldn't compete with that, and a lot of them just stopped accepting the recycling. Another thing that happened was recyclers in the U.S. started mixing everything together, and so the single stream programs where you mix everything together makes it a lot harder to separate, very expensive to separate in the U.S. or elsewhere. And it comes with a lot of garbage. So a lot of the U.S. buyers said, hey, we're not going to pay top dollar for a contaminated material. And China was doing that. So through the 90s and 2000s, the markets really shifted internationally. And then, sort of abruptly, China said, we're no longer going to buy that stuff. And so there's been a massive market glut. The good news is that, with something like paper, where you've got relatively good fibers, we're seeing those get cleaned up as a result. So lots of programs are focusing on education and cleanup. And we're seeing new markets emerge because if it's clean and it's cheap, somebody eventually is going to want to buy it.
Is there a push to localize this once more?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion. It's very hard to cite new paper mills, for example. So that infrastructure is very expensive, and it takes a long time to get through permitting processes, especially in a state like California with rigorous environmental standards. But we are seeing some of the old infrastructure getting retooled. Existing mills that had stopped buying recycled content, now that it's so cheap, they're saying, hey, well, maybe we can make some adjustments and start buying it again. There is a global demand for cardboard right now that's very strong, as you can imagine, with all the online purchasing. All those boxes have to get made out of something. It would be way better to have them made out of recycled paper rather than cutting down virgin forests and turning that into paper pulp.
That's a fantastic idea. And any other impact that Ecology might have seen that they can directly say this is related to the pandemic?
Well, like I said, we are seeing a lot more, household recycling, and we just want to really encourage people to keep recycling and to recycle well. It's cans and bottles, paper and cardboard. Don't if you have to guess about something, it probably shouldn't go in your recycling bin.
And on that, thank you so much, Executive Director of the Ecology Center in Berkeley, Martin BOURQUE, for talking to us.
Oh, thank you.
You're watching Chron on the Bay Area streaming news 24/7.